Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor. And today, it's Wednesday, which means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Here on my channel and over at Steve Donoghue's channel, we will have our world's finest team up every week where we talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book or graphic novel subject. I'll give my take on it. Steve Donoghue on his channel will give his take on it. And today, the thing we're talking about is Conan Chronicles Epic Collection Volume 1, Out of the Darksome Hills. And this contains the Conan comics that were published between 2003 and 2005. So there was a time when Conan shifted companies. Conan had been published for years and years by Marvel Comics. But at some point in the 90s, the Conan comic books, they were kind of a shadow of what they had once been. They were not selling particularly well. And at some point, Marvel Comics decided that it just wasn't worth it to keep the Conan license going. They had already canceled Conan the Barbarian, the Savage Sword of Conan. They had replaced them with some different Conan comics to see if they could jumpstart Conan again, I guess. Didn't work. And so finally they just gave up on our Sumerian. They gave up on Conan. Foolish. Foolish thing to do. But Dark Horse Comics was there to save the day, and Dark Horse picked up the rights to Conan. It was worth it to them. Dark Horse Comics is a much smaller comic book company than Marvel. And for a long time, they made a significant amount of their profits from comic books that were licensed. They did a lot of licensed comic books. So their biggest licensed comic book was Star Wars. Star Wars is what they made their money on for years and years. From the time of the prequels up until Disney got their greedy paws on Star Wars. And, of course, they owned Marvel. So, they would have the company they owned, Marvel, do the future Star Wars comics. And so Dark Horse lost the rights to Star Wars eventually. But for a long time, that's what they made their money on. That and other licensed books. And this was one of the characters that they licensed was Conan. And I remember when that shift happened, when I heard that Dark Horse was going to be publishing Conan, I was like, I figured it would be okay. Turns out it was really, really good. It started off really, really well, the Dark Horse Conan series. There was a point when they lost their way. But at the start, this series was really, really good. So this comic book was written by Kurt Busiek, and the artwork was done by Cary Nord for the most part. There were other writers, there were other artists, but those were the two main guys who were doing this comic book. Where is that beeping coming from? I don't know. Somebody's car. We'll just let anybody onto the manor nowadays. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes. The beginning of Dark Horse Conan comic books. So they started off with a little issue 0 where they had this. They had the legend, which is where you have a prince. There's this prince and his vizier there. And they stumble upon this cave. And inside this cave is this giant statue. That statue is, of course, King Conan, when Conan was a king. So the prince is fascinated. He says, who is this guy? He wants to know all about this guy because he looks at this character. He says, this is what he says. This man, he looks rough, dangerous, real. Something about his expression, his eyes. And that's what he's looking at there. So he's fascinated. So he wants to learn all about this guy. And so he has his vizier find out about him, and he starts telling the story. Now, the Vizier is suspiciously familiar looking. Turns out he was a wizard that who knew Conan and had trouble with him in the past, Thoth-Amon. And so he starts telling the story of Conan, and as soon as he starts it, know, O prince, that between the years when the oceans drank Atlantis, and the gleaming cities, and the years of the rise of the sons of Ares, there was an age undreamed of. Anybody who is a fan of Conan or has read Conan will recognize that immediately. And so this is the Vizier talking to the prince from Know, O Prince, which I thought was a nice touch. It was impressive. And this opening scene, which introduces Conan and Conan's story, is just beautiful. The artwork is just beautiful and fantastic. And that is the initial scene of Conan looking awesome. In the initial couple issues, Conan looked a little closer to the Frazetta Conan than some of the other Conans. And he looks other versions of Conan. And he looks different than Conan ended up looking. Cary Nord refined his version of Conan, so he started looking quite a bit different a little later in this epic collection. This was certainly a great start. And we can see right here that this is not going to be a watered down Conan. This is going to be the savage barbarian. This is just a great start. There he is. This is how Conan became king, barbarically. So it's great. I mean, when you saw this, or at least when we saw this, we knew we were going to get a really great version of Conan. And indeed, we did. And I love their version of Thoth-Amon there, who has lived for centuries and has to tell this story to the prince of a guy he really didn't like a whole lot. And then we get to the first issue of Conan. The designs on the covers are a little different than you'll see in other epic collections. This, like the Star Wars epic collections, just have the art. They don't have any of the titling or the letters page, since it was Dark Horse's design, and they're not Dark Horse comics. They just have the rights to publish these now. This is, of course, published by Marvel. Marvel, of course, has the rights to Conan now. And right away in the first issue, yeah, it's great. This is our Conan. And the artwork is fantastic right away. What Dark Horse did with their initial run of Conan stories is that they would adapt some stories in the chronological order of Conan's life, and in between those they would tell other stories to kind of fill in the gaps. Kind of what Roy Thomas was doing when Roy Thomas first did the Conan comic books. I think a lot of the actual adaptions of the stories were done better by Marvel, which is not to say these are bad, particularly the first one, The Frost Giant's Daughter. The first story in this, while it might not be as good as Barry Windsor Smith's version of it, it's a beautiful version of it. It looks fantastic, and it's written really well. My dog's making noise again. I don't know if you could hear it. She's in the other room. Banished. So, yeah, the artwork initially, this is from The Frost Giant's Daughter. I mean, it's just magnificent. They certainly got the right artist for the job in Cary Nord. And for first few issues, Conan is looking kind of Frank Frazetta-y. But eventually, pretty quickly, his look is refined and changed so that he looks different. This is a very different looking character than the character we got in the first couple issues, although the artist is the same. He just came up with like a lot of artists, when they get on a character for the first time, they start off one way and they just refine their art. Which is not to say it's not great, because it is. He had just a brilliant run, Kerry Nord, on this book. And this has Conan number 0 and numbers 1 through 19. So there's a lot packed into this epic collection. And they're also scattered throughout are these other stories. Let's see if I can get back here. Which tell of Conan's past. There's the prince again, and he's being told about a little bit about Conan's childhood. We have these stories about Conan's childhood, also written by Kurt Busiek, but the artist is Greg Ruth, who does all the art and the coloring on these particular stories about Conan the Kid. And they're actually really good stories. And they're kind of scattered throughout this epic collection. And there are a couple adaptations. We have The God in the Bowl, which was a Robert E. Howard story in here, and a bunch of other stuff that was done, just by Kurt Busiek to fill in those blanks. And everything in here is really great. This is a great epic collection. Like I said, for a long time, Dark Horse did some really, really good Conan comics. Their King Conan comics were fantastic. They just did an excellent job on this book. Eventually, around the time, they had different Conan comics. This was just Conan initially. Eventually, they did a couple other titles. They would finish one title, start another title. Eventually, they did a title called Conan the Barbarian, which was not great. It wasn't bad. It just wasn't Conan. They had lost their way, I think, when they got to that title. The art was really good, but the main character just didn't look like Conan, and wasn't written particularly like Conan. So we had a rough spot in Dark Horse's Conan comic books for a while. But I have to say, most of the Dark Horse Conan comic books were really good, particularly in the earlier years. And so the first few of these Conan Chronicles epic collections are really great. This particular one can be a little hard to find. Apparently this one is out of print. Steve Donoghue informed me that this is out of print. So I looked online. I think the cheapest that I saw this for was $70. And who knows what kind of shape that one is in. But that was the cheapest. This is what happens with Marvel Epic Collections. They'll go out of print. And, you know, maybe Marvel will reprint them, maybe they won't. Interestingly, they did also come out with this omnibus volume, which you can get for about $100. So that's not much more than you'll pay for this. In fact, you could probably get this cheaper than some sellers are selling this right now. This one is still in print. This is the omnibus. And it has all those initial stories. There are a couple missing issues that are published by the Epic Collections, although I think everything in here is in here. And the presentation in the omnibus, I think, is beautiful. It's heavy, it's big. Some people don't like that about the omnibuses, that they're so big. I mean, if you're incredibly strong like I am, it doesn't make any difference, you know. My Kryptonian strength, it's no problem to lift this thing, you know. But for some people, it's an issue. But still, the price is right now if you want to read these initial stories. And you can get them digitally as well if you don't mind digital comics. So there's a lot of different ways you can get them, some cheaper than others. I do recommend them, though, because they're fantastic. In this particular Epic collection, like a lot of Epic collections, they do have a lot of extras in the back. They have Kerry Nord's initial tryout stories, and this convinced them, just from these pages, to reproduce his original pencils without inks, which was unusual, and just color the pencils, which apparently is what they did, and it reproduced really well. You couldn't have gotten away with that, I think, at one time, quite as well as they do now. And yeah, in the back of the Epic Collection, excuse me, in the back of the Omnibus volume, it has even more extras. If it were me, and I were shopping around for these stories, I wouldn't pay $70 for this when you can get this for $100. That's just me. Again, you can get these digitally for a lot cheaper. But if you're a Conan fan, you're going to want to read this because the stories are really, really good. It has a different feel from the Marvel comics, but the quality of the stories in this volume are really, really good. These are excellent Conan comic books. The character feels like Conan at this point in Dark Horse's books. And like I said, Dark Horse did a lot of really good Conan comic books. They also did some excellent King Conan comic books, which I will show at some point because those were so darn good too. Those could have been some of the best comics they had were the King Conan comics. But yeah, this is an excellent volume. Hope you didn't hear too much of my barking dog. But yeah, that's Epic Comic Book Wednesday for this week. I will catch you next week, and be sure to catch me tomorrow when I talk about week 1 of February fantasy stories. Okay guys, I will catch you next time.